Queen Vale returned to Veles 2 days ahead of schedule, and nobody in the Tide Crown was ready for it except the storm. Her flagship came down through black rain and violet lightning, its hull lights burning through the weather, while below, the cliffside palace woke in a rush of confused protocol. Servants ran, lift chains groaned. Honor guards scrambled into lines that were almost straight by the time the first docking signal echoed through the upper halls. The Tide Crown was never truly quiet, not with turbines turning under the rock and salt wind singing through the shield arches, but that night the palace sounded wrong to Jonah Hale. He was in the eastern service spine replacing a failed pressure valve when the return alarm rolled through the walls. He paused with one gloved hand on the toolkit and listened past the formal chimes. There was movement above, too much of it and none of it in the right rhythm. The royal household believed the queen would not return until the next moon crossing, but one thing mattered more than protocol to Jonah. The queen's children were still in the upper nursery wing, and if the palace had been caught unready, then they were exposed. He sealed the panel, wiped his hands, and started toward the lift. On the way, he passed 2 corridor guards moving fast enough to forget the people beneath their notice. "Nursery team isn't answering," one said into his throat comm. "Check the inner doors again." Jonah kept walking, but every muscle in him tightened. Guards did not lose contact with the nursery. Not on Veles, not in the Tide Crown. If the nursery had gone dark, then either the systems had failed all at once, which was unlikely, or someone had arranged for them to. The lift carried him upward through the spine in silence. When the doors opened onto the nursery level, the first thing Jonah noticed was the light. Half the corridor lamps were dead, leaving long bands of shadow between the pale blue emergency strips at the floor edges. The second thing he noticed was what he did not hear: no boots, no station calls, no nurse chatter. The third thing was the smell, not blood, ozone, fresh-cut wiring. Jonah stepped out of the lift and let the doors close behind him. He moved past the sea-glass columns toward the nursery gate and found it standing slightly open. That made him stop cold. The nursery doors were biometrically sealed from dusk until dawn. He touched the panel beside the frame. Dead. Deliberately, Jonah eased the door wider and looked inside. The room glowed soft gold from the aquarium walls. Floating toys drifted above the rug field. The quadruplets were there, all 4 of them, alive and unconcerned. Leora was standing on a low bench trying to reach a drifting ribbon orb. Sen sat cross-legged beside an open picture display, his mantle fins folded neatly against his back. Miri had 3 plush Tide creatures lined up in a row and seemed to be lecturing them. Taven, the smallest, was chewing on the corner of a woven sleep blanket. They looked up together when Jonah stepped in. He saw not heirs or symbols or future rulers, only 4 children who had been left alone in the most protected room in the palace. "Evening," he said quietly. Leora pointed at him at once. "Tunnel man." Jonah almost smiled. He had fixed the humidity misters outside the nursery last month, and ever since then that was what they called him. "That's me," he said. "Where's Nurse Tao?" Sen tilted his head. "Gone." "Gone where?" Miri shrugged. "Door place." Jonah glanced back at the entrance, then toward the inactive security dome in the ceiling. Everything about the room said wrong. He crossed to the side wall and tapped the hidden staff channel. Nothing. Not static. Nothing. That was worse. He crouched to Leora's height. "All right," he said in a calm voice he had once used in collapsed shelters when frightened children watched adults for clues on how scared they should be. "We're going to play a different game tonight." Taven finally stopped chewing the blanket. "What game?" Jonah held up 2 fingers. "Maintenance game. Red light means freeze. Blue light means move. If I say red, you stop and make no sound. If I say blue, you follow me exactly. Can you do that?" Miri grinned first. "Easy," Sen nodded solemnly. Leora asked, "Do we win?" "Yes," Jonah said. "If we do it right, everybody wins." He went to the wardrobe niche, pulled out 4 travel wraps, and started fastening them around small shoulders with hands that stayed steady, because they had learned long ago how to stay steady first and shake later. When he reached Taven, the boy caught his sleeve. "Are we hiding?" Jonah met the child's wide silver eyes and chose the only truth that would help. We're being clever. He lifted Tavan onto one hip, took Miri's hand, and waited for the other two to line up. Then the corridor lights flickered again, and from somewhere far below in the palace came the low boom of a breached security door. Not thunder, not machinery. An internal explosion, controlled and precise. Leora's confidence wavered. Jonah lowered his voice. "Blue light," he said. The four children moved with him into the dim service corridor beyond the nursery just as the first palace alarm finally began to scream. Jonah did not take them toward the main stairs. That was the first decision that probably saved all five of their lives. The public routes of the Tide Crown were beautiful, open, and heavily watched, which meant they were useless the moment something went wrong. Instead, he led the quadruplets through a narrow service passage hidden behind a decorative shell panel at the end of the nursery wing. The panel opened only to maintenance clearance and had no reason to interest nobles, guards, or attackers unfamiliar with the palace's lower system. The passage beyond was tight, cool, and lined with humming conduits that ran down through the cliffside like metal veins. Leora wanted to ask questions immediately, which Jonah had expected. "Why are we not going to Mother?" she whispered. "Because right now I need to get you somewhere safe before I get you somewhere official," Jonah answered. Sen said nothing, but his eyes tracked everything, every turn, every locked hatch, every light strip. Miri stumbled once and squeezed Jonah's hand harder. Tavan stayed on Jonah's hip for 3 full corridors before wriggling down and insisting, very quietly, "I can walk." Jonah set him down at once. "Then walk like a shadow." Tavan looked pleased by that. A low tremor passed through the walls and made the conduit lights flutter. This time the children noticed. Miri looked up. "That was not thunder." "No," Jonah said. "It wasn't." He kept them moving. Red light at the corners. Blue light through the open stretches. They obeyed with the deadly seriousness children discover when a game starts feeling real. Halfway down the secondary shaft, Jonah stopped beside an inspection slit and looked through into one of the upper servant corridors. 3 armed figures in matte dark armor passed below at a fast tactical pace, helmets scanning, rifles low but ready. Not palace guard, not anyone who belonged in the Tide Crown. One of them said, "Nursery empty. Move to secondary search routes." Jonah felt something cold settle behind his ribs. This was not a robbery, not chaos, not random violence. They had gone for the heirs first and were now expanding outward. Tavan, standing beside his leg, tugged gently on his coverall. "Red light." Jonah looked down and realized he had frozen. "Yeah," he murmured. "Red light for 1 second. Then he crouched so all 4 children could see him clearly. "Listen to me carefully. There are bad people in the palace and they are looking for you. That means our game is important now. More important than anything. Can you do it?" The quadruplets stared at him. Leora's chin lifted first. "Yes." Sen nodded right after her. Miri swallowed and copied them. Tavan simply said, "I can be a shadow." He took them down another 3 levels into the maintenance arteries beneath the eastern royal wing, where the Tide Crown changed character completely. Gone were the silver walls, the floating lanterns, and the smooth ceremonial arches built for beauty. Down here there was only function. Pipe clusters, pressure locks, service lifts, flood channels, and heavy doors built to survive salt, corrosion, and bad weather. Jonah knew the lower arteries better than some of the architects who thought they had designed them. He also knew which rooms still had shielded panels, manual locks, and dead sensor corners. Maintenance Sector 18 met all 3 conditions. It was an old pump control annex with 1 reinforced entry, no external windows, thick machinery walls, and a dormant air filtration housing large enough to hide children in an emergency. Jonah ushered them inside, sealed the manual bolt, and killed the outer activity light with 2 fast switches by the door. The room dropped into soft blue emergency glow. For a moment none of the children spoke. The weight of what was happening had finally caught up with them. Miri looked around at the shelves of tools and coiled hoses and tried to be brave. "This place is ugly." Jonah nodded. "That's why I like it." That got the smallest flicker of a smile out of her. He moved quickly after that. A tool crate went against the door. 2 thermal blankets came off the shelf. He built a sheltered corner between the filtration housing and the coolant drums, then spread the blankets down to make it less like a hiding place and more like somewhere children could sit without feeling abandoned. Leora watched every motion. "You've done this before." It was not really a question. Jonah paused with a blanket in his hands. "Something like it," Sen finally spoke. "In war." Jonah looked at him, then properly looked and saw how sharp the boy's gaze was. Too sharp for his age. "Yes," he said, "in war." No one answered that for a moment. Then Tavan climbed into the blanket corner, dragged one of the folded wraps over his lap like a commander assuming a post, and declared, "This is the Shadow Fort." Jonah laughed once under his breath, grateful for the sound because it meant they had not been swallowed by fear yet. "Good," he said. "Stay in the fort unless I tell you otherwise." Once the children were settled, Jonah opened a maintenance wall panel and connected his handheld system scanner into the palace line. The first feeds were dead. The second were looped. The third finally gave him something useful. An overhead map of the eastern wing with 12 security nodes cut cleanly out and 3 internal doors forced open from authorized access. Someone inside the palace had handed the attackers a route. That explained the missing nursery team and the dark corridor. It also meant the danger was larger than one broken post or one captured guard captain. Jonah switched the feed to corridor cameras and found the search teams almost immediately. 2 units sweeping upper service halls, one blocking the central family passage, another moving down toward the lower arteries with a portable life sign scanner. He exhaled slowly through his nose. They were better than he hoped and worse than he feared. Behind him, metal clicked softly. He turned. The quadruplets had not panicked. They were sitting close together inside the blanket fort, passing around a palm-sized maintenance bot Jonah had left on the floor to keep their hands busy. The little machine rolled in confused circles while Tavan kept patting it and whispering, "Good shadow beetle." Miri looked up. "Are they close?" Jonah could have lied. He did not. "Closer than I like." Leora lifted her chin again, trying very hard to imitate courage she had only seen in adults. "Then what do we do?" Jonah leaned against the open panel and answered as calmly as if the world were not coming apart above them. "We stay smart, we stay quiet, and we make them earn every door." The scanner in his hand flickered once more, then resolved a red mark 2 corridors away. The search team had reached the maintenance level. Jonah closed the panel, slid the plasma arc tool from his belt, and looked at the children one by one. "Red light until I say otherwise." This time none of them even nodded. They just went still, exactly as taught, while the footsteps of armed strangers entered the dark below the palace. Jonah did not waste the silence after the scanner marked the search team 2 corridors away. He had spent too many years learning that panic was what happened in the seconds you failed to prepare. He crossed the pump annex fast and purposeful, pulling what he needed from shelves and tool bins with the same calm he used when replacing filtration valves. To anyone else it would have looked like maintenance. To Jonah it was defense by whatever survived the inventory log. He took a compact plasma arc tool and checked the charge. Good enough for 1 clean cut, maybe 2 ugly ones. Then a pressure battery from the emergency rack, a spool of conductor wire, 3 magnetic clamps, 1 foam seal canister, and a maintenance torch with a cracked grip that still ignited hot. He set them on the workbench in a straight line and only then looked back toward the blanket fort. The quadruplets were watching him with enormous silver eyes. They had not moved. They had not spoken. Even Tavan held the little maintenance bot still against his chest as if it understood the rules too. Jonah crouched so they could see his face. "You're doing well," he said softly. Miri's voice came out in the thinnest whisper. "Are they soldiers?" Jonah thought about lying again and decided children deserved better when the truth could help them survive. "Yes." Leora drew a tighter breath but nodded once, as if naming the danger made it easier to stand. Sen asked the question Jonah had expected from him eventually. "Will they kill us?" Jonah held the boy's gaze. "Not if I can help it." Then he pointed gently to the filtration housing behind them. If I say floodlight, all four of you get behind the silver drum and keep your heads down. If I say drift, you follow the blue light on the floor and don't stop until I touch your shoulder. Can you remember that? Floodlight means hide, Tavin murmured. Drift means follow. Right, Jonah said. Smart shadows. He went back to work. The room's entry door had a manual deadbolt and a weak electronic seal. Jonah used the pressure battery to overload the locking plate, then buried the wire beneath the frame seam so anyone cutting the panel would feed power back into their own breach tool. It would not kill a professional. It would just make the first entry ugly. He fixed two magnetic clamps low to the floor behind the threshold and wired them to a contact strip so that the first heavy armored body through the door would get dragged half a step offline. Not much. Enough. Then he cracked open the overhead service vent and sprayed the foam seal canister across the intake fins until the airflow reversed direction. If an intruder used aerosol scanners or thermal mist, the room would breathe wrong and distort the first read. He had learned tricks like that on colony evacuations, on stations where civilians died because systems told armed men the wrong thing 2 seconds too late. The memory came back sharp as salt. A corridor burning green. Children under a stairwell. A sergeant bleeding through a grin and shoving Jonah toward a maintenance hatch while saying, "You're not here to be brave, Hale. You're here to be useful." Jonah had been useful ever since. He killed the memory before it pulled him under and rechecked the wall panel. The red markers had split. One team was sweeping wide. The other had come straight toward 18. Professional. Deliberate. Somebody on the inside had given them a map, and not just any map. They were being funneled around blind corners and broken sensor zones like people who knew how the tide crown breathed. Jonah changed the feed and found the answer by accident on a lower hall camera. A palace functionary in dark advisor robes moving with an armed escort where no advisor belonged, holding one hand over a signet ring that flashed command access at every sealed door. Lord Verse, the Queen's senior domestic controller. Jonah had met him twice in 9 months, once when ordered to leave a passage because floor staff made noble guests uncomfortable, and once when told that maintenance workers did not need to understand why certain cameras should remain offline during private council meetings. Jonah stared at the image for 2 seconds, felt anger arrive cold and clean, and filed it away. Later, survive first, then remember everything. A soft scrape at the door pulled him back. Not the attackers yet. Sen had come out of the blanket fort without making more than a whisper of sound. The boy stood beside Jonah and looked up at the wall feed with quiet concentration. "That one," Sen said, pointing at Verse. "He came to the nursery 2 nights ago." Jonah turned to him. "Are you sure?" Sen nodded. "He smelled like bitter flowers. Nurse Tal was afraid of him." Jonah believed him instantly. Children noticed the details adults ignored because they did not yet know which details were supposed to matter. He lowered the scanner so the boy did not have to crane his neck. "Can you tell your brother and sisters that if anyone comes through that door and it isn't me, they go to floodlight without waiting?" Sen straightened, suddenly carrying a weight much older than his face. "Yes." Jonah rested a hand on the boy's shoulder for a brief second. "Good man." Sen went back to the fort a little taller than he had left it. The footsteps came a minute later, slow, measured, 4 sets. Jonah turned off the last active tool light and moved to the side of the door where the wall gave him cover and the arc tool gave him reach. Outside, a scanner hummed, then clicked. One of the soldiers muttered, "Life traces faded here." Another answered, "Rooms blind to central feed. Check it." Jonah could hear the scrape of gauntlets on the panel. Then a low curse. "Sealed manual," the team leader spoke next, voice flat and practiced. "Cut it." A thin whine began as a breech torch bit into the lock seam. The quadruplets remained silent. Jonah knew because he could hear the torch, the breathing outside, the vibration in the pipes, and nothing else. Not a sniffle, not a shift. Smart shadows just like he'd asked. Heat bled through the metal line by line. Jonah waited until the wire under the frame began to glow faintly. 3 more seconds. 2, 1. The torch broke through, hit the overloaded plate, and discharged back into the user with a sharp blue crack that lit the room edges for an instant. Someone shouted outside. Another voice snapped again. Good, competent, not scared enough. Jonah thumbed the arc tool alive and let its narrow blade hum blue in the dark. Last chance, the team leader called through the half-cut door. Open it and you live. Jonah looked once toward the blanket fort, toward four small shapes hidden in blue gloom, and answered in the calmest voice he had. No. The first breach charge blew the manual lock out of the frame and kicked the door inward hard enough to shake rust from the overhead conduit. Jonah was already moving. The lead attacker came through the opening with a compact rifle up and visor flaring for thermal targets, expecting fear, clutter, and easy control. Instead, he stepped into the pull field of Jonah's floor clamps and lost half a stride to the left. That was all Jonah needed. He came in low, drove the energized arc tool across the rifle housing, and turned the weapon into a shower of sparks before the man could fire. The attacker cursed, reached for a sidearm, and caught Jonah's shoulder instead as both of them slammed into the wall beside the door. Jonah felt old scar tissue pull across his ribs and ignored it. He pivoted, used the man's armor weight against him, and threw him backward into the threshold just as the second soldier tried to enter. Both went down in a collision of metal and momentum. Behind them, the team leader shouted, "Inside now!" Energy fire snapped through the half-open doorway. One bolt hit the workbench and exploded a rain of tools across the room. Another punched a glowing hole in the far wall above the filtration housing. Jonah dropped behind the overturned crate he had dragged into the center lane, rolled once, and came up with the cracked maintenance torch in his free hand. He triggered it blindly toward the doorway. The short cone of white heat slammed into the floor plates at the threshold and forced the next attacker back with a shout. "He's alone," one of them barked from the corridor, suddenly angry. "Push him." Jonah almost laughed at that. Men died in narrow spaces because they mistook alone for weak. He checked the blanket fort with one fast glance. Four small faces, low and silent in the blue glow. "Good, very good. Floodlight if I say it," he reminded them without looking away from the entrance. "We know," Leora answered in the faintest whisper. Even now she sounded offended that he would doubt her. The attackers changed tactics exactly as trained professionals would. They stopped crowding the kill funnel and started using the corridor. One weapon came in low, firing at knee height to make Jonah move. Another fired high to pin the center of the room. Smart, controlled. They were trying to carve the annex apart in layers until there was nowhere safe left to stand. Jonah retreated 2 steps at a time, keeping the crate and the dead angle of the filtration housing between himself and the door. He grabbed a coil of pressure hose from the floor, yanked the emergency release valve, and sent a screaming burst of compressed coolant fog through the room. The doorway vanished in white vapor. One of the soldiers advanced anyway, trusting armor and optics. That was the second mistake. Jonah slammed the last magnetic clamp onto the steel rim of the soldier's breastplate and keyed it live. The clamp ripped sideways toward the pipe stack and dragged the man off his firing line. He crashed into the corner hard enough to crack his helmet lens. Jonah was on him immediately, stripping the rifle free and hurling it across the room before the man could recover. The team leader fired through the fog and clipped Jonah high on the left arm. It was not a killing hit, just a burning line of impact that tore fabric, skin, and patience all at once. Jonah staggered back behind the crate, gritted his teeth, and heard Miri gasp from the fort. "I'm all right," he said, though his sleeve was already wet. The corridor voice came again, closer now and colder. "Human, this ends one way. You cannot hold a room forever." Jonah pressed his injured arm once, judged the bleeding as bad but not immediate death, and answered, "Long enough is all I need." A pause. "Then take the heirs. Leave him breathing if convenient." So that was the truth in plain words. Not murder first, seizure, hostages, leverage against the queen. Jonah filed that away too. Later, if there was a later. Above them, somewhere deep in the palace, another detonation rolled through the walls. Not near. Upper tier. The whole annex trembled, and with it the conduit lights flickered from blue to red and back again. For one sharp second the room changed color, and Jonah saw the children clearly in the half-dark. Tavan clinging to the maintenance bot like a talisman. Sen with one arm braced protectively in front of Miri without being told. Leora staring at the broken doorway with wide silver eyes and iron in her jaw. Children, yes, but royal children, raised around duty even before they had words for it. He could not let the room become a firefight. He needed space or shock or noise enough to break the attack rhythm. His gaze landed on the old flood control valve mounted beside the eastern wall. The annex was built next to a turbine drain and still carried emergency purge pressure. Dangerous, crude, perfect. He crossed the room under cover of another burst, nearly slipping in spilled coolant, and slammed the manual wheel open. The drain line answered like an angry sea. A deafening jet of pressurized water erupted from the side vent beside the doorway and hit the corridor wall with enough force to ricochet shrapnel like bolts and broken plating back into the attackers. Someone shouted. Someone else went down hard. The leader did not. Jonah saw the silhouette through the spray, broader than the others, visor burning red through the mist. Interesting, the man said, voice carrying even over the roar. A servant with field instincts. He stepped into the doorway without hurry, using the water blast and the chaos around him as if they were simply weather. His armor was heavier than the others, marked with a split-circle insignia Jonah did not recognize but knew instantly to be command. The rebel leader. He raised one hand and the remaining soldiers stopped firing. "I have lost 5 minutes and 3 weapons to a maintenance steward," he said. "That irritates me." Jonah kept the damaged rifle leveled despite the pain in his arm. "I can make it worse." The man's head tilted, studying him, then the half-hidden children behind him. "You were military." It was not a question. Jonah said nothing. The leader looked almost amused. "And now you clean floors in a palace that does not know what it hired." He took one more step in, careful now, respectful of danger at last. "Move aside. I only need the heirs." "Not happening. You cannot beat a palace coup with a tool bench and stubbornness." Jonah's mouth tightened. "You'd be surprised what humans have built with worse." That was when the hall speakers crackled back to life for half a second through damaged circuits. The voice that tore through the static was clear, furious, and unmistakably royal. "Seal all inner gates," Queen Saria Vale commanded somewhere above. "This is not a drill. Hunt them to the rock." The rebel leader went still. So did Jonah. The queen was inside the palace already. Early, unexpected, alive and issuing orders. Something like real urgency finally entered the man's stance. He looked once toward the corridor behind him, recalculating the whole operation in silence. Jonah saw it happen and knew the balance had shifted. Not enough to end this, but enough to make the next choice matter. The leader lowered his weapon an inch, then raised it again, angrier now because time had turned on him. "Then we finish this quickly," he said. Jonah braced, blood on one sleeve, water blasting across the threshold. 4 children behind him, and thought only one thing with absolute clarity. If the queen was in the palace, then all he had to do now was make sure her children were still alive when she found them. Queen Saria's voice over the damaged speaker changed the room more than the gunfire had. Jonah saw it in the rebel leader first. The man did not flinch, but the calculation in his stance altered. The operation had been built around absence, confusion, and quiet control. A queen arriving in the middle of it broke every clean line. "Your timing has improved," the leader said, almost to himself. Then his visor focused on Jonah again. "So has your luck." Jonah kept the scavenged rifle leveled even though his wounded arm was beginning to throb in deep, hot pulses all the way to his shoulder. "Wasn't luck that moved them out before you got here." The leader's gaze flicked once toward the blanket fort, then back. "No," he said, "that was competence, which makes this more unfortunate." He signaled with 2 fingers and the remaining rebels shifted in the corridor. Not charging now, spreading, preparing to break the room from angles instead of force the doorway again. Jonah saw it at once and understood the problem. They had lost the threshold but not the corridor. If they blew through the wall panels or vented the room, his position was finished. He lowered his voice without turning his head. "Floodlight on my call." "We know," Sen answered, steadier than any child should have been. The leader heard that and smiled behind the red glow of his visor. "Brave children." "Protected children," Jonah corrected. Then he fired. Not to kill. The first shot hit the damaged conduit over the corridor bend and showered the entrance in a cascade of white-hot sparks. The rebels recoiled on instinct, and Jonah used the heartbeat to move. He kicked the broken crate hard into the doorway, turned the maintenance torch wide, and blasted the pressure line above the eastern wall. Steam and salt water exploded across the annex in a blinding wave. The room vanished into hissing white. One rebel fired blind through the fog. The shot struck a shelf and sent metal parts screaming across the floor. Another shot hit the filtration housing inches above Leora's head. "Floodlight," Jonah barked. The children vanished behind the silver drum and low storage bins exactly as practiced. "Good, very good." Jonah moved left through the steam, using noise and memory instead of sight. A dark shape crossed the threshold. He slammed the maintenance torch into the attacker's chest plate, not long enough to cut through, just long enough to force him backward into the wall with a cry. The leader came through a second later, fast and low, sidearm in one hand, shock blade in the other. Jonah barely got the rifle up in time. The blade struck the barrel and sent current crawling through his palms. He lost the weapon, stumbled, and caught himself on the workbench edge just as the leader drove in again. They hit the bench together. Tools flew. The shock blade sliced a bright line through the metal table where Jonah's ribs had been a fraction earlier. He trapped the man's knife wrist with both hands, pain tearing through his wounded arm, and saw his own reflection warped across the rebel visor. "You are wasted in coveralls," the leader growled. Jonah head-butted him hard enough to crack the visor seal and answered, "You should have tried a quieter coup." Outside the annex, Queen Saria was learning how close she had come to losing everything. She moved through the lower service arteries with 12 loyal guard and twice that number of dead questions behind her. Every corridor she crossed made the same accusation. Disabled nursery lights, guard teams downed without alarms. Internal routes open from authorized access. Someone inside the Tide Crown had sold its children. The rage in her stayed cold because cold rage made better decisions. At her right side, Captain Hellion read the lower grid map from a wrist panel with disbelief hardening into certainty. "The breach paths all converge near the eastern maintenance spine," he said. "Someone herded the attackers toward the old service sectors." Saria did not slow. "And someone else moved my children before they arrived." She had already heard enough from shaken nurses and half-conscious guards to piece together the impossible shape of the night. A human maintenance steward had removed the heirs from the nursery minutes before the strike team reached it. A servant. A man the palace did not see until it needed him. She remembered him vaguely from passing corridors. A quiet human with respectful eyes and oil on his cuffs, never intrusive, never demanding notice. Now half her surviving guard spoke his name with the shocked, reverent tone people used for heroes they had personally underestimated. Jonah Hale. When they turned the last corner into Sector 18, the palace itself seemed to guide them. Steam rolled under the ceiling. The emergency strips along the floor glowed blue through haze. Gunfire cracked once, then stopped. Then came the sound of something heavy hitting the annex wall hard enough to ring the frame. Saria raised one hand. Her guard sealed the corridor behind her, weapons up. "Alive if possible," she said. "Mine before theirs." Inside the room, Jonah was losing ground by inches and buying survival by seconds. The rebel leader was better armed, better armored, and fighting without distraction. Jonah had only improvisation and the absolute refusal to let the man step past him. The shock blade came again. Jonah caught the leader's wrist with the magnetic clamp lead hanging from the wall and triggered the last charge still left in the contact strip. Blue current jumped through the damaged glove and locked the man's arm straight for an instant. Jonah drove him backward into the broken doorway with all the strength his frame still had. They crashed into the threshold together just as the Queen's guard hit from the corridor side. The first loyalist bolt punched through the rebel leader's side plating. The second dropped the last standing intruder behind him. Captain Hellion lunged through the steam and wrenched the leader's weapon arm up toward the ceiling, while two guards buried shock spears into the floor at his feet. In 3 breaths it was over. The rebel leader sagged to one knee, held in place by force and failing armor, and Jonah finally allowed himself to step back. The first thing he did was turn toward the silver drum. "Blue light," he said, voice rough now. 4 small heads appeared. Then all 4 children ran. Not to the guards, not to the queen first, to Jonah. Tavan reached him and clung to his leg. Miri grabbed his uninjured hand. Leora and Sen stopped only when they saw the blood on his sleeve, their brave faces cracking at last. Queen Saria stepped into the annex and saw everything in one glance. The steam, the scorched walls, the rebel bodies. The maintenance tools turned weapons. The human standing between the open room and the place her children had hidden, and her children choosing him before anyone else in the aftermath of fear. She crossed the room without hesitation. The quadruplets finally turned from Jonah and threw themselves into her arms. She dropped to her knees and held all 4 as if she could pull them back through time into safety. Only after counting each face, each breath, each small trembling body did she rise. Her gaze went to Jonah Hale. He stood bleeding, exhausted, and very clearly trying not to make himself the center of her gratitude. "You moved them before the strike reached the nursery," she said. Jonah nodded once. "Yes, your majesty. You held this room alone." He glanced at the ruined doorway, at the unconscious rebels, then back to her. "Not quite alone." He looked down at the children. "They followed instructions better than most soldiers I knew." To Jonah's surprise, the queen's mouth moved at one corner. Not a smile, something older and heavier. Recognition. Then she turned to Captain Hellion. "Find me the name of every person who helped open this palace from the inside." Her voice became iron. "And chain Lord Verse before he learns how completely he has failed." The rebel leader, still on his knees, lifted his damaged visor just enough to look at her. "This empire will fracture," he said. "Not tonight," Saria answered. Then she looked back at Jonah, at the blood on his sleeve, at the children still pressing close to him even now, and asked the question that changed the room. "Human, what were you before I made the mistake of wasting you on maintenance?" Jonah Hale looked at the queen for a long second before answering, not because he wanted to be dramatic, but because exhaustion had finally caught up enough to make every honest word feel heavier than the fight. The quadruplets were still pressed close to him and to their mother, all of them alive, all of them breathing, and in that moment he cared about little else. "I was evacuation corps," he said at last. "Frontier collapse zones. Civilian extraction, infrastructure salvage, and getting children out before fire or pressure or bad people made that impossible." Captain Hellion turned sharply. "You were trained for active conflict." Jonah gave a tired shrug with his good shoulder. "I was trained to get non-combatants home when active conflict had already ruined everything." Queen Saria held his gaze, studying the blood on his sleeve, the ruined tools around him, and the careful way he kept his body between the children and the open corridor even now that her guard had secured it. "And when that life ended?" she asked. Jonah glanced once at the damaged annex wall. "I got tired of places needing heroes after they had ignored maintenance." That made Hellion blink. It made the queen understand. She had ruled long enough to recognize bitterness that had hardened into discipline instead of cruelty. Before she could say more, Tavan tugged at her cloak and pointed accusingly at Jonah's arm. "He is leaking." That broke the room. Myra, no, not Myra from another story. Keep consistency. The nearest royal medic, who had just entered behind the guard, hurried forward with a triage field kit while Leora planted herself beside Jonah with a face so fierce it seemed impossible it belonged to a child. "Fix him first," she ordered the adults. Sen added, "He did not stop when they said they would take us." Miri, eyes wet now that the fear had somewhere to go, whispered, "He played the game so we would not be scared." The queen closed her eyes for one fraction of a second, a mother's private collapse contained inside a ruler's spine. When she opened them again, they were steady and very dangerous. "Medic," she said, You will keep this man conscious, mobile if possible, and alive without debate. Then to Jonah, softer, you stood where my palace failed. I will not forget that. The hours that followed moved with the harsh speed of aftermath. Lord Varys was found in a shielded archive trying to burn access records and was dragged into custody before he managed to speak himself into a second lie. 3 more conspirators surfaced under interrogation. The coup had been timed to the Queen's announced absence, the children's fixed nursery routine, and the assumption that the lower service sectors would be ignored by both attackers and defenders unless something went wrong. Something had, Jonah. By dawn, half the Tide Crown knew the story in fragments and half had added details of their own. Some said the human maintenance steward had fought 12 rebels alone. Some said he had known the attack before the first door failed. Others swore the quadruplets had gone silent on his command like trained cadets. The truth was simpler and, to many, more uncomfortable. A man the palace considered invisible had been the first to notice the pattern because invisible people had to notice everything. Queen Saria spent the night with her children in the secure inner wing, refusing all ceremonial rest and most advice. Twice the quadruplets woke from brief frightened sleep. Twice they asked the same question before they settled again. Where is Jonah? On the third time, when Tavin tried to climb out of bed because the room feels wrong without the tunnel man, the Queen sent for him. Jonah arrived at the inner family chamber with his arm bound, his left side wrapped, and a clean formal uniform someone had found for him that still could not hide the fact that he moved like a man assembled out of soreness and stubbornness. The quadruplets launched themselves off the sleeping platform before protocol could object. He barely had time to brace before 4 small bodies hit him with enough force to make his ribs complain. Easy, he murmured, smiling despite the pain. You're all still built like battering rams. You came back, Miri said, as if that had not been obvious. I said I would. Leora folded her arms and tried for royal composure, which lasted exactly 3 seconds before she reached for his good hand. Sen only looked up and asked, Are you staying? That question, more than the battle, more than the Queen's gratitude, was what left Jonah speechless for a moment. Queen Saria was watching from beside the tall sea-glass window, the black bioluminescent waves of Veles far below. That, she said, depends on whether you would accept a different kind of duty. Jonah straightened as much as his bandages allowed. Your Majesty. She crossed the room until she stood directly before him and the children. No throne, no court, no audience except the 4 lives that mattered most. The office of royal guardian is old, she said. Older than my reign, older than this palace. It is not merely a military role. It is trust granted in its purest and most dangerous form. The guardian stands between the heirs and whatever comes for them, but also within their daily lives, where influence matters as much as force. I would sooner place the title on someone born outside my empire and tested in truth than on any ornamented commander who still thinks rank sees more than service. Jonah's expression changed, not into pride, but into something rawer. Your Majesty, I clean ducts and service pumps. You noticed the dark corridor before my officers did, she said. You moved my children before my security net understood it had failed. You hid them, calmed them, armed yourself with scraps and held long enough for me to reach them. Titles describe value. They do not create it. Tavin squeezed Jonah's fingers. Also, you know the game. The Queen's mouth curved fully then, the first true smile anyone in the room had seen from her since her return. Also that, she said, Jonah Hale, will you accept appointment as royal guardian of the inner house? Jonah looked down at the quadruplets gathered around him, then back at the Queen. All the quiet years, all the deliberate smallness of surviving by not being noticed came to rest against one astonishing fact. He had been seen, not just for what he could do in a crisis, but for what kind of man he chose to be when nobody important was looking. Yes, he said, voice rough, if they want me. 4 children answered before their mother could. We do, Leora said first. Obviously, said Sen, very much, Miri added. Tavan only nodded with grave finality and leaned against Jonah's side as if the matter had already been decided long before adults found the right words. Queen Seria inclined her head, not as ruler to servant, but as one guardian of lives to another. Then it is done. When the court assembled later that day, it expected arrests, decrees, and the cold mechanics of restored order. It got all of those. Verse and the conspirators were named and condemned. Security reforms were announced. New oversight of internal palace access was established. Then the queen stepped down from the high dais, called Jonah Hale forward in full view of the nobles, officers, and advisors who had once passed him without a second glance, and placed the sign of the inner house over his chest. Gasps moved across the chamber when the quadruplets ran from their protected alcove and gathered around him without fear, possession, or doubt. "Let this be recorded," Queen Seria said, her voice carrying to every corner of the throne hall. "On the night my enemies came for the future of this dominion, the first shield my children found was not rank, not ceremony, and not legacy. It was a human servant who saw danger, chose courage, and refused to step aside. From this day onward, Jonah Hale stands as royal guardian of the inner house. Those who fail to respect him fail to respect my line." The hall went silent under the weight of that truth. Jonah stood in the center of it with 4 small heirs at his side and the memory of a dim maintenance room still alive in his bones, and understood that sometimes the greatest change in a palace began far below the throne, in corridors where only the overlooked learned how to hear what was wrong.